Hello, everyone, and welcome to the This is Meetup. My name is Sonu Kapoor, and I'm here with Ahmed Mustafa. We have a very exciting guest today with us, Lars. We are both the hosts of the new monthly meetup. We are very excited to start this episode with Lars on growing an open culture in open source. We got some fantastic events lined up for the coming months, complete with exciting giveaways and raffles featuring ebooks and software licenses. Be sure to check out our website for details and follow us on X for the latest updates. Stay tuned and join the fun. All right. Before we get started, why don't we go through some introductions? I'll start. I'm a senior Angular developer with over 2 decades of experience in software development, currently located in Canada, and I'm super excited about this meetup. Ahmed, you want to go next?
Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm Ahmad Mustafa, a senior full stack engineer working as ASP.NET and Angular. I've been around since AngularJS days. Started my career back in 2009. I also helped organize Franken.js in Nuremberg. Today, I'm excited to be here as a co-organizer and meet and share with all of you. Feel free to drop any question in the chat anytime. We'll answer them during the Q&A session. Let's make this great event together. You can also catch up with the organizer on X. Just follow the handles on top of our backgrounds and for more updates and behind the scenes and fun. So now back to you, Suno.
Thank you. Lars, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself for people that maybe do not know you yet?
Yeah, most importantly, I'm the co-founder of This is Learning, and This is Meetup is part of This is Learning. Now we have several projects that are all open source and all about open learning. So it's about free content that you can contribute to and you can access for free without any user registration or any other kinds of limitation. So I've been doing the This is Learning community for, I think, 3 years, maybe 4, I can't even remember, 3 years at least, together with Santosh Yadav. And it's always exciting to see new projects like the This is Meetup and This is Learning conference we had this year that you were also a huge part of.
Awesome. Thank you, Lars. Yeah, so why don't we go ahead and start with your presentation?
Good. Yeah, so today I want to talk to you about how to have an open culture in open source. It could also be an inner source or just other internal projects in your company. There's some good guidance for you to use as a beacon for the work and the projects you're part of. Maybe you could also use it to evaluate an open source project, whether it matches what you're looking for, or if you are an open source maintainer or contributor, you can or have some kind of influence in an inner source or open source project. You can use some of these principles to have a more open source project. So this is about open as in openness. And importantly, it's not about what's right or wrong. Just saying that there is a spectrum here going from open to closed. And maybe for some things you want it to be very open, and for other things you want it to be more of a closed project with private communication. So this is a slide about me. I founded This is Learning. I'm also the organizer of a Danish meetup called Aarhus.js. I am an open source maintainer myself. I authored a book or two. I'm a GitHub star and a Microsoft MVP, an NX champion, and Angular Hero of Education as well. To start with this talk, I actually want to talk about an article by a guy called Matt Rocklin. It's called The 7 Stages of Open Software. And in this article, he goes through the 7 stages from when an open source project is first created to the founder of the project actually moving on to other efforts and leaving it in the hands of the community. So the first one is where you focus on the fundamental things like the public source code. And the second stage, a public license. Maybe it's OSI approved. Then we move on to a later stage where we start accepting contributions and take our time to consider contributions from external contributors. Then finally, we can move on to stages 4, where now it's more a kind of open development, so that the development and even the planning in the next stage happens in the open, so not behind closed doors. So we'll have public meeting notes or public meetings where anyone can join, and anyone can get a say in what's important for this project, vote on what's important for this project, and help plan and determine what will be done in this project. The final stages then is multi-institution engagement, or maybe just multi-contributor, depending on the size of the project. This is to start removing the bias of having only one organization or even one maintainer managing and maintaining the entire project. And finally, the final stage, as I mentioned, is when the original author or authors will retire from the project and leaving it in the hands of the community in hopefully in a good place, right? So moving through all these stages, there's always a lot of decisions about how can we handle the different things we need to consider when going through these stages. And to contrast this, I will start by talking about what's a very open culture. And after that, we'll talk about what's a closed culture mindset, whether it's inner source or open source projects. So open source, from my perspective, is a commitment. It's a way of honoring the commitment of doing open source in the open, as in openness. And I think we should follow these principles in an open source project, at least to be more open. So it's about building trust and driving collaboration in the community, and also increase the quality of our projects. We can do that with the 3 core principles of openness, transparency, and inclusivity. So what is an open culture? It's a community or a culture that promotes free and equal access for everyone. So talking about access here, it includes but is not limited to access to the source code, access to executables, access to distributing the project, access to modifying the project. And in this term, we mean access to everyone, not only the team or the company maintaining this project. An open culture is one that enables community members to use and copy and modify the project, regardless of where they're from, the resources they have, the access they have to various tools, the skill set they have, or the experience and background they have. So this will ensure that there's no favoritism, there's no limitations based on sponsorship or other factors like that, that contributing or using the project shouldn't require proprietary systems or access, and it shouldn't require access to private communication technologies either. Following these principles, the project will be accessible to newcomers, and it'll welcome even non-code contributions and consider them equally important. So for comparison, now let's look at a closed culture and what that looks like in certain circumstances and aspects. What does the open in open source actually mean? Open source is a bit of a buzzword, more so 1 or 2 years ago. Today, the buzzword of the day is AI, but open source is still in the mix as well. So maybe if you're in an open source project maintained by a company, you might not, if you have been used to public open source projects, maybe you wouldn't consider it very open, because maybe the mindset will be well, we're too busy to accept contributions, so we'll just focus on our own development. You might have seen this in some projects, or even been part of some projects where this was the case. And this is what happens when open source is just a buzzword or a way to monetize a project, or even just for the sake of vanity and being popular. This is often seen in big tech and commercial organizations and regulated industries or monopoly industries. Monetization is often seen in startups and to fund and attract investments, or to do the open source bait and switch, where you start with a very open source project, everyone can use it, everything's free, and then eventually you switch the license with a closed license. We've seen this with Docker, MongoDB, Elastic, Akka, Terraform, and Redis. So there's many examples of monetizing, making the project more closed. Vanity, well, this is when you are doing open source for the sake of prestige, or joining an open source foundation, or attracting outside investments. And about the buzzword, well, that's what happens when everyone thinks they should do open source, but they don't understand how or even why they should do open source. So another mindset might be, well, no one else is contributing, so let's just govern and manage this project internally instead of out in the open. But to this I say, what do you think comes first? An open community or an open culture? And the answer here is, you need the open culture first to start growing the community, to start attracting contributions. If you are a closed culture, it'll be that much harder for anyone to contribute to your project. I have personally been part of some open source projects backed by enterprises, and this was very different from maintaining and contributing to open source projects that are more public and backed by individual contributors, not by a company. And what I saw in some of these projects was open source was more of a checklist. So maybe, as we see in this sheet here, maybe it's like being at the doctor, and the doctor is saying, it seems like you're suffering from the sickness known as open source. You're using a popular license, you're publishing your code to the GitHub repo, and you put something in the security file because someone told us we have to do that. We create some sort of governance document, and we write some lines in the contributing doc, and we add maybe a CLA because you never know. And we also add these long license headers to all files because legal said we have to do that. So is this an open source project? Yeah, technically it is, but is it open? That's the question. I've seen many developers that didn't know what's open in an open source project beyond just having public code and having an open source license. But there's much more to it, at least if we consider open as in openness, all these things we're talking about today. So my answer to giving some guidance on this open versus closed culture is a set of guiding principles that I call the community experience. And the first one is time to first experience. How fast can anyone use this project in any environment? So not in a just getting to use the project in any way. It doesn't happen to be on their local machine. Maybe it's just an online interactive demo. So what's the fastest time they can start using or trying our product or our project to see what it's like and whether it's something for them? So maybe you set up a sandbox environment with GitHub pages, or Azure Static Web Apps, or Azure Container Apps, or Netlify, or anything really. So a deployed environment where anyone can go and try the project for the first time. So this is the time to first experience, and it sounds like a metric, but it's not really about measuring it. It's just about having a principle to guide you towards openness in your project to attract all these good things like contributions and a community and more contributors, more maintainers, and more to govern the project in the open. The second one here is the time to first line of code. So how fast can anyone develop a system using this project? Maybe we'll add tooling like code generators, development containers, GitHub code spaces, or StackBlitz web containers. There's many options today. So how fast can someone start developing using our open source project? Next principle is time to first environment. So how fast can anyone use our project in an environment that's controlled by them or their organization? So maybe to support this, we could add infrastructure as code components or OCI container images. There's some good examples of this tooling to support this. If you would look at Azure, they have the Azure CLI, the Azure Developer CLI, Azure Static Web App CLI, and a bunch of other things, GitHub Actions as well. If we look at NX, the monorepo and build framework toolchain, they have GitHub Actions and reusable workflows. They have GitHub Apps, Circle CI orbs, Azure Pipeline tasks, and StackBlitz web containers, all of this to support the time to first environment. I maintain a logging library for Angular called Lumberjack, and at some point we created template repos for community plugins, because this is a plugin-based logging library. And for plugins you didn't want to make public, but you wanted to add your custom plugin for your own organization, we added code generators that could be used with the Angular CLI, for example. So these are other examples of supporting the time to first environment guiding principle. Next one is the time to first contribution. So to support this, we could have guidelines for submitting a patch or submitting a feature request or bug report, or guidelines and tool chains for vulnerability disclosures and signing off on contributions. We could add supportive development tooling like development containers and GitHub code spaces that anyone can use for free. Maybe we have some documentation, and it's easy to contribute to the documentation because we have this link called edit this page, for example, using Docusaurus, and it'll take you straight to the GitHub Markdown document, and you can start editing it and contribute very easily from there. Yeah, in This is Learning, we actually use Docusaurus quite a lot. We use it for some of our contributors who maintain libraries, open source packages. We use it for our open learning courses that are free text-based online courses. So these tools can help different kinds of open source projects, not only packages or applications. Because we have to remember that contributing to open source is not only about contributing to code. It's also improving the documentation or contributing to a course, a different module to this course, or just correcting a typo, or maybe translating it to another language. And the same goes for the documentation for different open source projects. The final principle of the community experience principles is ecosystem support. So there's lots of things we can do to support this principle. Maybe we would create prefab content kits available for everyone. Maybe it's a press kit, but for community content. Maybe we have logos and images, other graphics that people can use. We have slide decks, templates, and prefabs, and teacher-student resources for our project, workshop resources, e-learning modules, certification programs, tutorials, articles, books, videos, events. There's so many things we can add to our to the ecosystem of our open source project. So that was the final one of these community experience guiding principles. Finally, before we start going through some questions about all of this and more, we can talk a bit about open culture advocacy and governance. So these are, there's a lot to this topic, but these are some of my favorite and most important areas in my experience. There's the topic of open communication. This is in a community where we have focus on the visibility of communication in the project. There's an emphasis on communicating out in the open. Our project members will primarily communicate using tools that are freely available and open to anyone. Maybe it's a public Discord, a public Slack, mailing lists, GitHub discussions, GitHub issues and pull requests on public repos. The project members will present plenty of opportunities for engagement and direct communication with the community. Community communication is welcome and inclusive, and newcomers especially are supported through guidance and mentorship of finding their way around the project and contributing or using the project. This goes for community members and minority populations as well. They're not treated differently. In fact, an open culture will give a voice to the minority populations by frequently asking them how the community can improve to better meet their needs. If we compare this to a closed culture in terms of communications, closed communication, that looks like restricted or limited access to some of the communication tools based on sponsorship levels or other factors. Discussions that have direct impact to the project, like architectural decisions, development decisions, they happen in private chats rooms or private mailing lists. There's little or no help or support available to new community members that are just entering the project and getting their first experiences. So what's the call to action here to improve or to have more open communication? It's using open communication tools that are platform agnostic and commonly used by other open source projects. It's avoiding direct and private communication to show respect for community members' time and attention, as well to ensure an equal and open access to communication for anyone interested in our project. The next topic that I find important is open documentation. It helps both maintainers, contributors, users, and developers of the open source community. It promotes modification, and without documentation, it's difficult to understand the source code if you have the intent of modifying, which is part of an open source project, the intention of open source project from the very beginning. There's this organization called the Open Source Ecology, and they state that undocumented open source is effectively not open. So an open culture in terms of documentation will make sure that documentation is available to everyone and that newcomers are supported when it comes to using and contributing to the project. There's more to documentation than end user documentation. If we have very excellent documentation, it covers all aspects of our project. For the project itself, there could be the mission, the governance, the community structure, the release cadence, the roadmap and priorities, the use cases, the FAQs. Of course, depending on the size of the project, maybe these things are not important to my one-person open source project, but if it grows, it'll become more and more important at some point in the future. For user-facing documentation, we could have installation guides, user guides and tutorials, API guides and references, architectural overviews, and testimonial section, guidelines for participation, so meaning feature request processes, bug report processes. For code contributors, we could document how to get involved. We could have developer guides and tutorials for contributing. You could have an API guide. and a detailed architecture that maps to subsystems and services in a large, complicated system. We could document the development process that we use in our project. We could have guidelines for participating in code contribution. So the process of requesting features, submitting patches, reporting bugs, vulnerability disclosures, and sign off on contribution. So commits, individual commits. If we compare this to the closed culture in terms of documentation, well, a closed project will have undocumented open source projects. So they'll just say, here's the source code, go use it. But there will be no documentation on how to use it or what it does or why it's there and all these kinds of things. Or maybe there is documentation, but it's hidden or hard to find, or it's closed or has very limited access to just a few people or organizations. Or maybe there is documentation, but it's not very good documentation, or maybe it's unmaintained and stale. Or maybe just there's little or no help at all to newcomers or new users, new contributors that are just getting their first experience with this project. That's also an example of a closed culture. So to improve in terms of documentation of our project, for individual contributors, we can review and improve the contribution guidelines for our project, both when it comes to development and documentation and all these other things we talked about. We can improve the documentation by explaining architectural decisions, the structure of our code, the modules or features we have implemented in the system. We can spend time reviewing documentation contributions and get feedback and offer ideas for improving the contributions. And we can add good inline documentation to the source code itself, making it easier to navigate and understand. If we're part of a bigger open source project or system and we're part of the leadership or an open source foundation, we could make sure to prioritize documentation as a parallel track to the source code, because technical writing is a different discipline from developing code. So if you have a large project, you might also want dedicated people to taking care of the efforts that goes into improving the documentation itself and all these other resources. We could help incentivize contributors to write good documentation by using intrinsic motivation, so not by giving them money or fame, but by making it interesting and valuable for them to make these contributions. Maybe if it's a corporate-backed project, we could sponsor interns or technical writers to create the documentation if it's not very open yet. Or we could support good documentation in ways of clear and proper licensing and copyright information, because one of the big failures of open source projects is not emphasizing that this is actually open and free and openly accessible, because even if you have an open source license, not everyone understands what the implication is of having that license when it comes to commercial use or proprietary systems. So explaining this in your documentation can be more valuable than you might think. Governance, I think we'll take this one as well, because there's a question that we'll discuss that ties into this topic. So governance means many things. It means transparency in terms of open governance, at least. Who can participate in the discussions about this project? Who can decide on critical matters? How transparent are the decision-making processes? And can anyone, literally anyone, follow project discussions and meetings? If not, then it's not a very open governance that we have in this project. In open source, there's often the term meritocracy. This is the policy or commitment that individuals that lead the project get their roles based on their talent and efforts and achievements in the project, so not in terms of how many years of experience in general development or which company they're employed by. No, their contributions directly to this project is what will help them get to promoted to maintainers or managers of this project, for example. This ensures that this meritocracy ensures that accessibility of any contributor to get promoted to committer, reviewer, maintainer, manager, and the process of going from a new contributor to one of these roles is clearly documented, and we ensure that it's equitable so that anyone has an equal chance of achieving this. In terms of governance, an open culture is focused on visibility and has an emphasis on open decision making. This gives an equal footing to current and future contributors. It makes sure that community members can access discussion platforms and decision-making mechanisms and project roadmaps so we can understand why and how the project makes decisions. An open culture will welcome newcomers with the freedom and access to participate in public discussions, in development, and in testing. So this could be as simple as having public betas, for example, with feedback loops. We also make sure that anyone can submit a patch. Both developers and users are involved in the testing aspect of our project, so that users have a more direct path to influence the project, even if they're not contributing code or contributing documentation, but they're contributing their feedback on the decisions being made and the software being released in our project. So in open source and in open governance in particular, meritocracy is what drives advancements and acceptance by granting project leadership roles to the contributors who provide the most value to our community, no matter the background or any of these other factors we discussed. So contrasting this again to a closed culture in terms of governance, closed culture would have open source that's so-called strategic open source. We talked about the buzzwords and the monetization and the vanity factors. This is strategic open source. A closed culture will not even have any governance model, or they will have a governance and community structure that is absolutely dominated or biased towards one individual, one certain company, or a coalition of companies or countries or commercial interests, or usually this is the founding company or author of the project. A closed culture has discriminatory governance that excludes certain groups of people and or organizations for whatever reason. This is a closed culture aspect. It could also have limited access to based on sponsorship levels or other factors. A closed culture in terms of governance has no clear path for community members to how they get promoted to committer or reviewer or maintainer or manager. And a closed culture has hidden or closed or obscured or limited decision-making processes. So to improve our governance to a more open culture, as an individual contributor, we can understand, follow, and participate in our open governance processes and advocate for them to be more open. We can support the right structure for the size of the project. We can recommend improvements based on our own experience when participating in this or other projects. If we're a part of a leadership group of a more complex open source project, once we establish new or additional open source projects with industry partners, say Microsoft or GitHub, we aim for a balanced governance that gives equal footing to all participants, So this is a governance model that welcomes contributors and supports a diverse community. If we were part of an open source foundation like the OpenJS Foundation or the .NET Foundation or the Linux Foundation or any of its subsidiaries, we could advise the projects we host in our foundation on the best open source governance models based on our experience from other projects that we help host and incubate. And we also support our projects to implement this governance models of the open culture aspects of it. If we are part of leadership or a foundation, additionally, we can help decide on project governance and community structures that have growth and scale in mind to support the longevity of our project, that it'll be around for many, many years, because we invest a lot of time and effort into this. We can adopt best practices that work well in our other projects, and we can build in the ability to change the governance as the project evolves. We can support new projects when they start creating and documenting their processes even before they launch to the public. Of course, these processes of governance, they all change over time, but it is a huge benefit to have something in place when the project kicks off, rather than it being an afterthought or just ending up being very closed as a result of this. Yeah, let's spend a little time on this, and then we'll move on to the questions. So open access to development tools. This is important to all open source projects. In an open culture, we have free and open access to CI/CD systems, source code repos, bug tracking systems, documentation. So all of this is free and openly available to anyone and doesn't exclude certain people. So development tools are accessible even to newcomers that are new to the project. Contrast this with the closed culture, where there's no development environment or a very poor one available to contributors. Maybe it doesn't have support for Linux or Mac OS or Windows. Maybe it requires access to internal or proprietary systems. Maybe there's limited access based on sponsorships or other factors. Maybe it has limited access and dependencies on proprietary tools. And these all prohibit non-corporate contributors from participating in the development efforts of our project. So to improve in this area, we can use and promote the best open source tools available. We can make sure that all of these tools are free and openly available, that they're accessible to newcomers, and we can guide and mentor newcomers to the use of these development tools that we have in our project. This talk is actually inspired by a white paper by the Linux Foundation called Determining the True Openness of Open Source. So you can see more details if you're interested in all of these topics. Other than that, that's the end of this talk. And now we'll move on to the questions from you, Ahmed and Sonny.
Thank you very much, Lars. So yeah, as we said, so we have two small questions. So the first one is, how can an open source communities effectively manage the transfer of knowledge? So ensuring that the new contributors can learn from experienced members while maintaining an open and collaborative environment.
Yeah, transfer of knowledge. Well, it's about guiding and mentoring newcomers, whether they are new users or new contributors. Of course, that doesn't scale very well. So you're eventually better off also investing in documentation and development tooling and these other supportive technologies like code generation, template repos, and CI/CD systems that are available to everyone. Because then you start automating and externalizing this knowledge and expertise from one or few individuals to something that's openly available to anyone.
Okay, thank you very much. And then the second and last one is something that we mostly face is about conflicts. So it's inevitable in any collaborative environment. So how should open source communities handle disagreements and conflicts in a way that promotes growth rather than division of the team?
Well, it depends on the type of the conflict. What's one example that you could have in mind of a type of conflict?
So one of the things we mostly have is pull request conflict. So somebody created a pull request which has an idea, okay, this is the right way to do it. And then you have another point of view from another person, which is also not wrong, but it's different. So a small conflict starts. It's just a small example. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you mentioned the trigger word, someone is wrong. In terms of software, that's rarely the case that someone is straight up wrong. It's more about basing your opinions and your contributions and your comments on experience from other projects and from this project, and communicating in a way that's inclusive and open. I would say in this particular case, before you start a pull request, make sure that there is an issue for what you're trying to solve. And if there isn't one, create it yourself and get feedback from the maintainers on the potential decisions you should make, the design processes they go through to follow the code structure and best practices of their project before you start writing code and saying, here's the feature or bug fix or whatever. So that's very important. Either issues or maybe it's a GitHub discussion that's preferred to get some feedback from other community members in a more open format before you submit the actual issue. Or maybe it's in the public Discord server where you can talk in a more real-time manner of communicating with the community and the maintainers of the project.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lars. I think these are the two questions I have. Sono, do you have other questions?
Yeah, I do have one. So what challenges, sorry, do you see, when promoting an open culture in larger open source projects?
Oh, well, it depends on the organization. If the organization is brand new to the concept of open source or doesn't have a very good understanding of open source, well, first we need to make sure that they understand the fundamentals of having an open source project, that it's not only about having source code available or an open source license. It's also about these other things that we talked about, of being open in welcoming people to the community, making it easier to contribute, making it easier to get up and running and get started using or deploying it to your own environment. All these things goes into that. And maybe if it's an experienced company, but there's always room to make the project and the culture of the project more open, even if it's not open source, even if it's inner source or straight up proprietary systems that you're working in several teams. We often see conflicts like the one you mentioned, Ahmed, between when you have to collaborate between different teams. So to counter this, we can start going towards a more open culture where we make decisions in the open. We communicate about what we're doing. We make it easy to access the things we're doing and the decisions and influence them. We make opportunities for direct engagement with the people directly involved in the project. And yeah, really all these other things we talked about today. These are all parts of the more open you are, the less of these challenges you will face in terms of conflicts and misunderstandings and miscommunication, or a community that never grows.
Makes sense. Thank you, Lars. Back to you, Ahmed.
Yeah, thanks, Sono. So, as we wrap up today's event, we would like to thank Lars a lot for being here. It's a very interesting topic today. And we want to extend the huge thank you for everybody who joined us. The energy and participation have made this gathering really special. Remember, we've got some exciting events coming up in the next few months, including fantastic giveaways and raffles with ebooks and software licenses. So don't miss out and check our websites for more details and X. Back to you, Sono.
Yeah, thank you. So again, feel free to connect with us on X. Would love to keep the conversation going and hear your feedback. And if you missed anything or want to revisit today's discussion, this meetup will be uploaded on YouTube. So keep an eye out for the link in our website and the social channels. And again, don't forget, you can send us your questions at any time and we'll get your answers. Thanks again, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the future.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for having me. And my slides will be available on SpeakerDeck.
Thank you very much, Lars.